His name is Hit, and 8 weeks ago the Marvel Universe did not know he existed. This is the story of how it learned. Here is the first thing you need to understand. The Marvel Universe has survived everything. Chitauri armadas pouring through a hole torn in the Manhattan sky. A purple-skinned demigod acquiring enough power to erase half of all living things with a finger snap. Celestials the size of planets parking themselves in Earth's orbit and debating whether humanity deserves to keep existing. Marvel has answered every single one of those threats. Its heroes are built for exactly that category of crisis. They are built for the announced apocalypse, the dramatic invasion, the enemy that arrives with a fleet and a manifesto, and enough raw destructive power to register on every satellite above the planet simultaneously. What they are not built for is the absence of all that. What they are not built for is silence. And silence, in this story, is all Hit is. He does not arrive through a portal crackling with dimensional energy. No sky splits open above New York to deposit him in a shower of debris and light. No tectonic tremor announces his displacement across universes. One moment the alley is empty in the way that alleys in this city are always technically empty even when they are not. And then a man is standing in it, coat buttoned, posture carrying the absolute economy of someone who has not wasted a single physical movement in 600 years. The city noise continues around him unchanged, a symphony of horns and distant sirens and the compressed mechanical breath of 8 million lives running in parallel. None of it registers on his face as relevant. He looks at the cityscape the way a surgeon looks at a body on the table before the first cut, not with excitement, not with admiration, with inventory. 600 years. Let that number sit for a moment before we go any further because the number is load-bearing in this story. Tony Stark is considered a generational genius. His combat experience, the depth and variety and lethality of what he has survived and learned from, spans roughly 15 years of active operation. Steve Rogers has been fighting wars since 1941, with a long interruption in the ice that he did not experience as time. T'Challa carries centuries of Wakandan tactical tradition in his bloodline and his training. These are, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary accumulations of experience. Hit has been working for 600 years, continuously, professionally, without failure, against targets who could destroy planets. The gap between Marvel's most experienced fighters and the man standing in that alley is not a gap in power. It is a gap in time, and time specifically is what Hit controls. So before this story goes where it has to go, understand the real question. Not whether Hit can beat Thor in a straight fight, though we will get there. Not whether Tony's armor can survive contact with the time skip, though that answer is illuminating. The real question is the one that makes this crossover genuinely unsettling rather than just spectacular. How much damage can one precise, utterly emotionless professional do to a civilization of superhumans who have trained their entire careers to answer loud threats before they even realize the thing hunting them does not make noise? That question has an answer. The answer takes 8 weeks, and by the end of it, the Marvel Universe will have lost 59 people, shattered 3 criminal networks, broken the institutional confidence of the world's most sophisticated intelligence agency, and produced 4 distinct adaptive countermeasures specifically engineered to answer a single man's methodology. 1 man, 8 weeks, 0 announcements, 0 dramatics, just the work. If this were any other crossover, Hit would walk into the first available fight, establish dominance, and the rest of the story would be about power levels. But Hit is not that kind of entity. He does not want dominance. He does not want recognition. In 6 centuries of professional operation across multiple galaxies, he has never once sought an audience for what he does. He does not fight to prove a point. He eliminates to fulfill a contract, and when there is no contract, he studies to prepare for the next one. What he does in the first 3 days after arriving in Marvel's universe is something that most crossover analyses never account for. He stands still. He watches. He catalogs the response architecture of an entirely unfamiliar civilization with the patient, comprehensive attention of something that does not get bored and does not get tired, and experiences the passage of time at a fundamentally different rate than the heroes who will eventually try to stop him. By the time he moves, he will know more about how this universe defends itself than most of its own defenders have ever needed to consciously articulate. The Marvel Universe is loud. That is not a criticism. It is a structural fact with enormous strategic implications. Its most powerful figures operate publicly, projecting signatures detectable from orbit. Its institutions communicate through channels that, however encrypted, leave patterns. Its heroes respond to crises collectively, visibly, in ways that can be studied and timed and modeled. Every piece of that infrastructure, every brilliant adaptation and layered defense system and redundant protocol is built around a shared foundational assumption that the threat will be perceivable before it becomes decisive, that there will be a moment between the arrival and the damage where the system can engage. Its entire methodology lives inside that moment. Not after it. Inside it. Between the arrival and the perceivable, in the fraction of a second that every detection system, every reaction time, every tactical protocol treats as instantaneous because it has never had a reason to subdivide it. That is Hit's address. That is where he operates. And Marvel does not have a defense stationed there because it has never in its history needed one. By the time S.H.I.E.L.D. runs its first anomaly report, he will already be 3 assignments deep. By the time the Avengers are formally briefed, the criminal ecosystem of 4 cities will be structurally compromised at its load-bearing foundations, and nobody will have connected the incidents into a single picture yet. By the time Dr. Strange looks up from a spell and realizes that recent time has the wrong shape in 17 specific locations, the mythology of an invisible professional will already be moving through the underworld like a theological event. And somewhere in New York, on a rooftop that commands a clean sight line across 3 city blocks, a man in a coat will be watching the response to his work with the same flat, complete attention he brought to the first observation 3 days after arrival. Taking notes, adjusting the model, deciding what comes next. The Marvel Universe has survived gods and monsters and the end of everything. It has never been studied by something this patient before. That is the difference. And the difference is everything. Before the Marvel Universe can understand what is happening to it, we need to understand what HIT actually is. Not in the way a database entry describes a threat, not in the flat clinical language of power classification and ability taxonomy, in the way that matters for everything that follows. Because the single most common mistake in analyzing a being like HIT is starting with the question of how strong he is. Strength is the wrong axis entirely. There are beings in Dragon Ball's universe that dwarf HIT in raw destructive output by orders of magnitude that make the comparison almost meaningless. HIT has operated in that universe, against clients and targets drawn from its highest power echelons, for 600 years without a single failed contract. He has done this not by being the strongest thing in the room. He has done it by being the most correct thing in the room. Every single time, without exception. For 6 centuries. The distinction between strongest and most correct is the entire story. His primary ability is called the time skip. In the Dragon Ball anime's depiction, it manifests as a localized pocket of displaced time, a kaleidoscopic interval where HIT exists fully operational while everything surrounding him freezes at the threshold of perceivability. In the manga's more grounded interpretation, it reads closer to a surgical time stop, a cage constructed around the immediate operational space, lasting fractions of a second but delivering complete freedom of movement within those fractions. The script synthesizes both interpretations into something that fits precisely within Marvel's physical framework. HIT carves a sliver of time out of linear causality and moves inside it, not faster than the eye can follow, outside the interval in which following is possible. Every sensor system ever engineered, every reaction time ever trained, every defensive protocol ever designed operates between perceivable moments. HIT operates inside the gap those systems treat as instantaneous. The impact lands before the alarm fires. The room changes before the observer's nervous system reports that anything moved. Beyond the time skip, his combat philosophy produces a profile that has no clean analog in Marvel's existing threat database. He does not waste movement. In 600 years of professional operation, the concept of a performative strike, a blow thrown to intimidate or demonstrate or communicate anything beyond its direct lethal purpose, has been completely eliminated from his methodology. Every movement is the minimum geometry required for the maximum necessary outcome, and nothing beyond that. He reads opponents in real time with a comprehensive spatial and tactical intelligence that converts each exchange into data, each defensive response into a more refined attack angle. He does not get better over years of practice the way most fighters improve. He gets better in the middle of the engagement currently happening, extracting the information he needs from his opponent's rhythm within seconds and deploying what that information reveals before the opponent understands that the reading has occurred. He improves faster than you can notice he is improving. Now look at Marvel, the way a 6th-century-old professional assassin from a galaxy-spanning criminal ecosystem would look at it for the first time. Not with awe, with inventory. The first thing that registers is the noise. Not physical noise, though there is plenty of that. Informational noise. The Marvel Universe broadcasts itself constantly and comprehensively. Tony Stark's armor carries an energy signature detectable from low orbit. Thor's lightning is visible from 3 states away before the thunder arrives. The Hulk's location is knowable within minutes of his activation by anyone with access to seismic monitoring. Even the most covert elements of Marvel's power infrastructure, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s intelligence networks, the Avengers' communication architecture, Wakanda's diplomatic and strategic channels leave patterns. Consistent, recurring, analyzable patterns. A being that has spent 600 years reading power structures across multiple civilizations would recognize those patterns within days and begin constructing a comprehensive operational map before making a single move. The structural vulnerabilities compound the informational exposure. Marvel as an institution is reactive in its deepest architecture. Its response protocols are genuinely extraordinary at what they do, mobilizing the appropriate tier of superhuman defense against identified threats with a speed and coordination that has saved civilization multiple times. The operating word is identified. The entire system is calibrated to engage after a threat has crossed the threshold of perceivability, after the anomaly has registered, after the detection step has fired, and the classification process has produced a response category. HIT would begin operating inside the interval before the detection step has anything to detect. Not stealthily in the conventional sense, not cloaked or digitally erased or dimensionally shifted. Simply not yet perceivable as a threat event, because threat events in Marvel's framework require either energy discharge, physical destruction, or behavioral anomaly at a scale that registers on a system calibrated for gods. A man standing still in an alley registers as nothing. His first 3 days in the Marvel Universe would be invisible by design. Not because he is hiding, because observation at this stage costs him nothing and pays him everything. He would map the communication frequencies of S.H.I.E.L.D. field operatives through the secondary electromagnetic footprint of their encrypted channels, a pattern recognition task his operational experience makes trivially achievable. He would time the response intervals between reported street-level incidents and the arrival of costumed responders in 3 separate New York boroughs, building a statistical model of deployment speed by tier and geography. He would identify the nodes in the criminal ecosystem where information consolidates, where the load-bearing connective tissue of multiple networks passes through single human bottlenecks, and file each of those nodes under the category his professional framework designates for structural targets. Not most powerful, most consequential when removed. The operational plan assembles itself from available data the way a diagnosis assembles itself from symptoms, quietly, correctly, before the patient knows they are sick. Tony Stark would be the first high-tier mind to encounter the data trail, though he would not know it yet. Friday runs routine cross-referencing of S.H.I.E.L.D. anomaly reports against the parameters Tony flagged after a conversation with Pepper about threat categorization gaps in their monitoring architecture, a conversation that happened 18 months ago over dinner and that Tony translated into a passive filter running in the background of his surveillance systems out of pure compulsive habit. The filter catches something on day 19, not an energy signature, not a physical event. A statistical improbability in the medical examiner reports from 3 separate New York precincts. The anatomical precision of fatal injuries across 11 unconnected cases is clustering at a coefficient that Tony's probability modeling rates as occurring naturally at 1 in approximately 400 million. Friday flags it as low priority because the flag category is forensic rather than energy-based. Tony glances at it, files it mentally, and returns to the reactor efficiency problem he was working on. He does not yet know that the filter has just caught the edge of the most significant threat event currently active in his universe. He will. What makes Marvel uniquely dangerous to hit, the counterweight to its structural vulnerabilities, is also what makes it the most interesting environment he has ever operated in. It is a universe of genuine, extraordinary layered intelligence. Tony Stark's analytical capability is not human in any meaningful operational sense. It is human in biology and superhuman in processing, running threat models at a speed and depth that approximates artificial intelligence while carrying the creative lateral thinking of a mind that has survived things that should have killed it. Stephen Strange has accumulated mystical and strategic knowledge across dimensions that make his cognitive framework broader than any single universe's threat library. T'Challa carries the concentrated military and geopolitical intelligence of a civilization that has been quietly the most advanced on its planet for centuries. Steve Rogers possesses a tactical reading of human behavior and institutional systems that 6 decades of warfare and political crisis have refined to something close to a sixth sense. These minds, when they eventually turn their full attention to the pattern Hit is creating, will not be slow. They will be fast. Faster than anything he has encountered before. The question the story is really asking is not whether they are fast enough to stop him. It is whether they are fast enough to stop him before the damage reaches the level where stopping him stops mattering. The first 11 incidents do not exist as a pattern. They exist as individual data points scattered across 3 cities, 4 criminal networks, and 6 weeks of routine forensic processing, each one filed under its own case number, assigned to its own investigator, sitting in its own silo with no thread connecting it to anything adjacent. A Magia logistics coordinator found dead in a parking structure in Red Hook, Cosbaz. Of death listed as catastrophic internal trauma of undetermined origin. A Hydra communications officer who simply stops appearing in any record, physical or digital, on a Tuesday morning in Chicago. A mercenary contractor operating across Madripoor and 2 Eastern European cities who ceases to exist in the professional ecosystem with no explanation that his network can construct from available evidence. No bodies in the last 2 cases. No struggle evidence in any of them. No forensic signature that matches any known enhanced operative's attack profile in the entire SHIELD threat database. They do not look like a pattern yet. They look like an unusually clean few weeks in a world that has always had unusually clean weeks sometimes. The medical examiner who writes the 4th report is a 20-year veteran named Dr. Patricia Walsh, and she uses a word in her findings that she has used exactly once before in her career: surgical. Not in the metaphorical sense that investigators sometimes reach for when describing precise criminal methodology, in the literal anatomical sense. The fatal trauma in Case 4 is delivered to a cluster of specific internal coordinates that, in Walsh's professional assessment, would require either perfect foreknowledge of the target's precise internal anatomy or a targeting capability so refined that it found those coordinates dynamically, in motion, against a target who by all environmental evidence was not cooperating with the process. She flags the report for secondary review. The secondary reviewer agrees with the assessment and adds a notation of his own. The force delivery to those coordinates is not just precisely aimed, it is precisely measured, exactly sufficient to produce the intended outcome, not more. The word he adds to Walsh's surgical is calibrated. Together, the 2 words describe something that neither of them has professional language adequate to fully contain. Daredevil finds the wrong kind of silence on a Wednesday night in Hell's Kitchen, and finds it 3 times across 2 weeks before he trusts what he is reading from it. Matt Murdock's relationship with the acoustic landscape of his city is the most intimate and comprehensive surveillance system currently operating at street level in New York. He hears the city the way a musician hears an orchestra, not as undifferentiated noise, but as a structured composition where every instrument's presence and absence carries specific informational weight. What he registers on those 3 Wednesday nights is not an anomaly in sound, it is an anomaly in the space between sounds, a quality of listening that the ambient noise is wrapping around rather than filling, not the silence of absence, the silence of presence holding its breath with 6 centuries of professional discipline behind the restraint. He investigates each location immediately, finds nothing, which is, for a man whose entire operational philosophy rests on the certainty that his senses do not produce false positives, significantly more disturbing than finding something. Natasha Romanoff enters the picture through pure operational coincidence on day 31. She is running a SHIELD-adjacent surveillance operation targeting a Hydra financing channel, a routine assignment by the standards of her career, and she enters a safe house in the West Village approximately 45 seconds after a contract has been completed inside it. The target is gone. The room is still in the physical sense, but wrong in the atmospheric sense, carrying a quality she has spent her entire adult life learning to read in the same way Walsh reads anatomy. The air pressure is fractionally, almost imperceptibly different from what it should be for a room that has been empty since its last documented occupancy. She stops at the threshold and runs very thing she has across the space. Visual, acoustic, olfactory. The total sensory inventory of a woman who has survived things that should have killed her by trusting the compound output of every input simultaneously. Nothing presents. Nobody there. Just the room and its almost wrongness. She files a report that uses the word professional 7 times in 4 paragraphs. In her private notes, she writes one additional word that does not make the official report: better. SHIELD analyst Rachel Chen connects the timestamp anomalies on day 38, and the connection arrives not through algorithmic detection, but through the particular human cognitive pattern that her supervisor has twice described in her performance reviews as an uncomfortable gift for finding things that were not supposed to be findable. She is cross-referencing security footage from 3 unrelated incidents across 2 cities, looking for a completely different thread in a completely different investigation, when she notices that the timestamp discontinuities in all 3 feeds share an identical duration. Not similar, identical to 4 decimal places. She sits with that for a long moment in the specific way that analysts sit with data that is simultaneously meaningless in isolation and deafening in combination. A compression error does not produce identical duration anomalies across 3 different camera systems manufactured by 3 different companies operating in 2 different cities. Compression errors are messy. This is not messy. This is a signature. She does not know yet what it is a signature of. She knows with complete professional certainty that it is intentional. She pulls every incident report that shares any forensic characteristic with her 3 cases and begins building the map that her agency should have started building 3 weeks ago. Peter Parker swings through Midtown on a Thursday evening in the specific state of distracted competence that characterizes his patrol rhythm when nothing immediately threatening is happening, his mind running through a physics problem set due Friday, while his body handles the mechanical business of staying airborne, and his spider sense maintains its background monitoring of the operational environment. The danger sense is a system he has learned to read in gradations over years of survival. Sharp spike means incoming impact. Broad radiation means environmental instability. Directional pressure means threat vector. What fires in the alley below him at 7:43 p.m. is none of those established categories. It is low, sustained, directional in a way that points not toward him, but toward his awareness of the space below, as if the sense is registering not danger aimed at Peter Parker, but the quality of attention being paid to the area by something that has not yet decided whether Peter Parker is relevant to its current calculation. He pulls up on a rooftop and looks down. Empty alley. The feeling fades over approximately 20 seconds, weakening with the directionality of something moving away rather than deactivating. He files it as noise and keeps moving. He will remember it later in a context that makes filing it as noise feel like a significant error in retrospect. By day 40, the Underworld of 3 cities is running the story in the specific way that information moves through criminal ecosystems, in fragments, in the heavily edited language of people describing something they are not entirely sure they believe, through channels that do not officially exist to people who are not officially connected. No name attaches to the emerging narrative because there is no name available, no face, no origin, no known affiliation with any established criminal or political or human organization in any database that the Underworld's considerable intelligence resources can access. What circulates instead is a description built entirely from absence. Contracts vanishing, operators going silent, Targets eliminated with a cleanliness that carries no signature recognizable to even the most experienced professional observers of how lethal things get done. The Madripoor ecosystem, which prides itself on having seen and survived every category of violent professional the world produces, is doing something that visitors to the island notice without being able to name immediately. It is being careful. Not the performed carefulness of people managing known risks, the genuine instinctive carefulness of people who have encountered something that has temporarily exceeded their threat modeling capacity. Kingpin receives the compiled intelligence summary on day 44 and reads it with the total physical stillness that his inner circle understands as his most dangerous processing state, the one that precedes decisions that restructure things at a foundational level. He reads it once. Then he does something that produces more alarm in the people who work for him than any outburst could generate. He quietly cancels 3 scheduled public appearances, reduces his visible security from 12 to 4, instructs those 4 to dress in a way that does not identify them as security. His chief of staff pieces together the reasoning 48 hours later. Wilson Fisk read a description of a professional who kills structural nodes before ego targets, who studies systems before dismantling them, who leaves no evidence because evidence is itself a form of communication, and this operator does not communicate. And he recognized, in the architecture of that methodology, a specific category of predator that his own considerable strategic intelligence had always classified as theoretical rather than operational, the kind that does not come for you because you are powerful. The kind that comes for you when your removal serves the larger structural logic of a campaign you have not yet been informed exists. Fisk does not know if he is on the list. The not knowing is the point. And somewhere in the compressed, calculating silence of whatever position HIT currently occupies in this city, the observation phase is drawing toward its conclusion with the same patient inevitability it is drawn toward conclusions in 100 other environments across 600 years. The data collection is almost complete. The work, the real work, is about to begin, and Marvel is still arguing about whether the disappearances are connected. The Avengers briefing happens on a Wednesday morning in a conference room that has hosted discussions about alien invasions, multiversal collapse events, and the logistics of reversing universal genocide. The people sitting around this table have a collective threat response experience that spans dimensions and timelines and the outer edges of physical reality. They do not rattle easily. Nick Fury, or the operational equivalent occupying his strategic function in this moment, stands at the front of the room and walks them through 31 confirmed incidents across 9 cities spanning 6 weeks. 31 targets. 31 clean eliminations. 0 conventional evidence in every single case. The room listens with the particular quality of attention that only activates when something genuinely new has entered the equation, not the practiced alertness of professionals managing a known category of crisis, but the specific, slightly different attentiveness of people encountering a problem their existing frameworks are not generating useful outputs for. The room is very quiet during this briefing. Not tense quiet, thinking quiet, which is, in many ways, more alarming. Tony Stark pulls the full medical examiner dataset before us. The briefing ends and begins running it through his combat modeling architecture in parallel with listening, because Tony's relationship with linear attention has always been approximate at best. The results return in minutes, and he reads them twice. In a career defined by encountering things that should not be possible and immediately engineering around them, reading something twice is a tell that the people who know him well recognize as meaningful. The anatomical precision of the fatal strikes does not just exceed human capability. It exceeds the documented capability of every enhanced combatant in his database whose attack profile involves physical contact. The force delivery is not larger than anything he has cataloged. It is more correct than anything he has cataloged, targeting biological coordinates so specific that the strikes bypass durability as a variable entirely. You do not need to be stronger than the target if you know precisely where to touch them so that strength becomes irrelevant. Tony flags this conclusion in red, stares at it, then opens a secondary modeling window and starts working a problem he has never had to work before. Not how to defeat a stronger opponent, how to build a sensor architecture for an opponent who strikes between the moments his sensors use to construct their picture of reality. Steve Rogers takes the target list home. not metaphorically. He physically carries a printed copy, because Steve's analytical process for tactical problems has always worked better away from screens and institutional atmospheres, and spreads it across his kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He studies the selection for 4 hours, not the method, the logic. Because Steve understands at a foundational level that how an operator chooses their targets tells you more about their capability ceiling, their objective structure, and their strategic sophistication than any amount of forensic analysis of the kills themselves. What assembles itself from 4 hours of patient mapping is both clarifying and deeply unsettling. The targets are structural, every single one. Not the most powerful available figures, not the most symbolically significant, not the choices that would produce maximum visible disruption, the choices that, when removed, quietly collapse the connective tissue holding multiple systems together. Communication nodes, logistics coordinators, the mid-tier operators who translate upper-level criminal authority into street-level execution. Someone is not attacking Marvel's world. Someone is editing it, removing specific sentences and watching the paragraph lose coherence. Steve knows this methodology because in a different context, serving a different purpose, he helped develop it. Seeing it deployed against the civilization he has spent his life defending produces a cold, specific feeling in his chest that he does not share with anyone at the morning debrief. Tony deploys the first countermeasure 48 hours after the briefing. It is not a weapon, it is a sensor network, 73 micronodes distributed across Manhattan, calibrated not to detect energy signatures or motion events, but temporal micro-discontinuities, gaps in local causality smaller than any standard instrument considers worth recording. The engineering required to build something sensitive enough to catch what the timestamp anomalies implied takes 31 hours of consecutive work. Friday monitors his biometrics through hour 22 and issues 3 separate fatigue advisories that Tony dismisses without reading. The network goes live on a Friday morning, produces 17 false positives from subway vibration interference in the first 6 hours, gets recalibrated twice, and settles into operational parameters by evening. On the third day, at 2:14 a.m., a single node in the Garment District Regis tears a discontinuity lasting 0.3 seconds. The local camera shows an empty street. The discontinuity is clean, precise, and matches the timestamp anomaly profile exactly. Tony has a location, 30 minutes old. He sits in his lab looking at the data for a long moment and says quietly to no one in particular that whatever this is, it already knew the camera was there. T'Challa arrives at the strategic table with something none of the other responses have produced. Not a detection system or a forensic analysis or a tactical map, a behavioral profile. Wakandan intelligence operatives embedded across 3 criminal networks have been feeding consolidated reports to Birnanzana since week 2, and T'Challa has read every one with the specific attention he reserves for problems that his instincts classify as categorically different from their surface presentation. What the behavioral data describes, assembled across 47 confirmed incidents, is a psychological profile he has encountered in exactly one previous context. His father's most classified strategic documents contained a theoretical framework called the Invisible Sovereign, a category of operator defined not by power, but by the complete elimination of ego from strategic decision-making. Every target choice optimized for structural consequence rather than symbolic impact. Every operational decision stripped of performance entirely. T'Challa had always read that framework as theoretical, a thought experiment about a category of threat that the universe's tendency toward ego-driven power expression made practically impossible. He places the behavioral profile on the table and tells the assembled team that they are not dealing with a supervillain. They are dealing with the operational manifestation of a theory his father's military philosophy considered too dangerous to exist in practice. The room receives this in silence. Dr. Strange is in the middle of a diagnostic spell on an unrelated dimensional anomaly near the Nevada desert when his mystical awareness produces a texture it has no existing category for. He is not sensing a magical event, not a dimensional breach, not a temporal rupture in the large-scale sense that his awareness is calibrated to flag. What he is sensing is structural, subtle, and deeply wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when they have been very precisely interfered with by something that understood their architecture well enough to leave the surrounding structure intact. The closest analogy his vast vocabulary of the impossible can produce is a document with certain words surgically removed, complete and coherent on either side of each excision, but carrying in the excised spaces a faint structural wrongness that only becomes apparent when you are sensitive to the document's original grammar. He cross-references the sensation's coordinates against the SHIELD incident reports through channels the agency is not fully aware he accesses, and the alignment is exact. Every temporal irregularity maps directly onto a confirmed incident location. He sits with this for a long time before he picks up the phone. His call to Tony Stark lasts 11 minutes and covers more genuinely new theoretical ground than most of their conversations, which is a high bar. Strange explains that the residue he is reading is not magical, not technological, not dimensional in any conventional sense. It reads as a natural phenomenon expressed through an individual, the way echolocation is natural to a bat rather than a power the bat invokes. Tony's response is to immediately run the implication against his sensor network's calibration parameters and understand, in the same moment, why the network caught one event in 3 days of operation, despite the target being demonstrably active throughout that period. The network is looking for a signature. What it should be looking for is the absence shaped like a signature. The difference is not technical, it is philosophical, and philosophy, Tony reflects during the 3 seconds of silence after Strange makes this point, is not traditionally where his threat response architecture has been strongest. He starts rebuilding the detection layer from a different foundational assumption. Strange ends the call and makes no further outward communications for the next 6 hours, sitting in the deep quiet of the sanctum with the accumulated weight of what the residue told him about the quality of presence producing it. No ego, no ambition, no cruelty, no hunger. Just the absolute, total, 6th century deep completion of purpose. He has encountered pure evil. He has stood before beings of incomprehensible destructive appetite. He has never encountered anything that felt this completely empty of everything except competence. And in the particular taxonomy of things that terrify Stephen Strange, that specific emptiness is filing itself into a category near the top. What none of them know yet. Not Tony with his recalibrated sensor network, not Steve with his structural target map, not T'Challa with his behavioral profile, not Strange with his causal archaeology and his specific new category of fear, is that HIT has been aware of all 4 investigative efforts since approximately their midpoints. The sensor network he registered and began feeding irregular interval data to make the modeling incrementally less accurate with each new data point. Strange's mystical probe he simply did not exist within when it passed, going still in the way that fundamental constants go still when a measurement instrument passes through them, present but not in the register the instrument is built to detect. Steve's target map he allowed to approach accuracy because a map that is almost correct produces more confident and therefore more predictable responses than a map that is obviously incomplete. And T'Challa's behavioral profile, the most accurate picture currently being assembled of what HIT actually is, he has not yet addressed. Because T'Challa reached the correct conclusion, and the correct conclusion, in HIT's professional calculus, means that the King of Wakanda has just become the most strategically significant mind currently active in Marvel's response architecture, which means T'Challa has just moved to a different position in the operational picture, not a target, not yet, but a variable that requires specific attention going forward. The observation phase is over, the map is complete. And in the silence between moments, a decision is being finalized that Marvel's assembled intelligence, for all its extraordinary capability, does not yet know is happening. Peter Parker finds the body on a Thursday night, and the finding itself is unremarkable by the standards of his career. Midtown produces bodies with a regularity that would alarm anyone who did not spend their evenings swinging above it at rooftop height, and the particular body in the service corridor behind the parking structure on West 47th Street belongs to a man named Salazar, whose professional activities were, by any reasonable moral accounting, not oriented toward the general welfare of the civilization Peter has spent his adolescence and early adulthood protecting. The forensic details are what stop him at the threshold rather than the fact of the death itself. The stillness is wrong, not the slack, collapsed stillness of violence and its immediate physical aftermath. A different quality entirely. Considered, geometric, as if the final arrangement of the scene was the last deliberate act performed in It, rather than the residue of a struggle. Peter's danger sense does not spike. It hums. Low, directional, sustained, pointing not at the body, but at the dark end of the corridor ahead, where the light from the street does not reach and the shadows carry the specific quality of being occupied. He moves the way Peter Parker moves when the danger sense has already overridden the conscious decision-making process, which is to say he moves before he has decided to move, his body executing a lateral displacement and vertical redirect that his mind catches up with approximately a quarter second after it has already happened. The air where his head was produces a pressure event that registers on no instrument and makes no sound, not the displaced air of a fast-moving object, which has a recognizable acoustic signature that Peter's enhanced senses know intimately. Something different. Pressure without displacement. Force without the physical medium that force normally requires to travel through space. As if the attack did not move through the air to reach its target but simply existed at the target's location during an interval when the target's location was slightly different than intended. He hits the far wall, rebounds, and faces the corridor. Empty. His danger sense is fading now, directional signal weakening in the specific pattern that indicates the source is moving away rather than repositioning. He stands there for 4 full seconds. For Spider-Man, 4 full seconds of motionless processing represents a response to something that has genuinely exceeded his existing threat model. He has faced the Vulture and the Green Goblin and Venom and Mysterio and beings that operate at scales those names cannot approach. None of them felt like this. None of them struck from a location that was not a location until after the strike had already occurred. Tony gets the full incident report within the hour and does something immediately uncharacteristic. He does not start engineering. He sits. In a career defined by converting threat data into countermeasure architecture at a speed that makes most people's analytical processes look geological, sitting with information unprocessed for any length of time is a behavior reserved for problems that have temporarily exceeded the rate at which his frameworks can generate useful responses. What has exceeded the framework is the spider sense data point. Peter Parker's precognitive danger sense is, in Tony's operational assessment, the most reliable early warning system operating at human scale in the known superhuman world. It has never, in any documented encounter, failed to provide adequate response time against a close-range attack in an enclosed space. The corridor incident does not represent a failure of that system. It represents the system operating at its absolute maximum output, delivering survival by a margin. Tony's reconstruction algorithm estimates at approximately 1 inch against an attack that was already in execution before any conventional detection system would have registered that an attack was occurring. Tony models the same scenario against a target without Peter's specific capability. The model does not produce a survivor. He deploys the sensor network the following morning. 73 nodes across Manhattan calibrated to temporal micro-discontinuities rather than conventional threat signatures, and simultaneously begins a secondary engineering track that the corridor data has made suddenly urgent. The network is a detection tool. What the corridor demonstrated is that detection without an adequate response interval is forensic rather than protective. Knowing that the time skip happened after it has happened does not prevent the next one. The response, archaeology, needs to operate at the level of prediction rather than perception, routing around the impossibility of seeing inside the interval by modeling where the attack will emerge from on its far side using the pre-interval positional data. It is the combat engineering equivalent of predicting where lightning will strike by reading the atmospheric conditions rather than watching for the bolt. Tony spends 31 hours building the predictive layer. Friday issues 4 fatigue advisories. Pepper physically removes 2 coffee cups from his reach during hour 26 and replaces them with water, which he does not drink. The system goes live at 6 a.m. on a Saturday and in controlled simulation testing produces a 67% strike prediction accuracy. Tony looks at the number for a long moment, then looks at the alternative, which the corridor data has defined very precisely as 0. He decides 67% is the most meaningful engineering achievement of the past calendar year. Steve's structural analysis of the target list reaches its conclusion on the same Saturday afternoon, and he brings it to the team with the specific quality of delivery he reserves for findings that he wishes were wrong. The map assembled from 47 confirmed incidents does not describe a campaign in progress. It describes a campaign in preparation. Every eliminated target, when plotted against the organizational architecture of the networks they belong to, marks a load-bearing node whose removal degrades the network's coordination capacity without immediately collapsing it. The networks are still nominally functional. They are functioning the way a building whose internal columns have been quietly removed is still nominally standing. The structural integrity is gone. The appearance of integrity remains just long enough for the occupants to not evacuate. What Steve cannot identify from the available data is what the prepared campaign is preparation for. The criminal and intelligence tier damage is comprehensive and strategically coherent, but it is too broad to point toward a single specific objective. It describes a general degradation of Marvel's Underworld communication and coordination infrastructure as an end in itself, or it describes the preliminary clearing of operational space for something that the available data has not yet made visible. Steve tells the team both interpretations. Then he tells them which one his instincts are producing, the one where this was preparation. The room receives this in the particular silence of people who had been hoping for the other interpretation. The Brooklyn operation is Steve's design, and it is a good one. A shield safehouse containing a surviving communication node, one of the few remaining structural elements of a Hydra financing network that Hit's campaign has otherwise comprehensively dismantled, positioned as visible bait inside an invisible kill box. Tony overhead in high-altitude passive monitoring, T'Challa across the street running Wakandan kinetic analysis, Steve inside the building. The trap's geometry is excellent. Its foundational assumption is the problem. The foundational assumption is that the target will approach the bait without prior intelligence about the operational context surrounding it. Hit enters the building through the service entrance at 3:17 a.m., and Steve knows immediately, not from a sensor alert, not from Tony's overhead feed, but from the quality of the silence inside the building changing in a way that decades of warfare have trained his nervous system to read as a specific and unambiguous signal. He is on his feet and moving before the conscious categorization has completed. Shield coming up in the same motion. First exchange happening in a approximately 90 seconds of real time that Steve's adrenalized perception stretches across what feels like considerably longer. He blocks something he did not see coming. The vibration transmitted through the vibranium face of the shield is not massive. It is precise in a way that the shield's composition has never previously been used to communicate. The force delivered to the exact quadrant that, connecting with its intended target rather than the shield, would have ended the engagement in its first second. Steve has sparred with Thor. He has traded blows with Tony in full armor. He has a combat intelligence so refined that most opponents become partially transparent to him within the first few exchanges, their patterns emerging from the noise of engagement like shapes clarifying through fog. Hit gives him nothing. No pattern, no emotional signal in the body language, no rhythm his tactical mind can isolate and use. Between engagements, there is a stillness so complete that Steve's threat-reading instincts, operating at their maximum trained sensitivity, find no surface to process. He is fighting something that decides, moment to moment, when to be a fight and when to be a wall, and the decision criteria are not available to him. Tony arrives through the roof at 3:17:51, 8 seconds from alert to entry. In the empty corridor afterward, Steve tells him that 8 seconds is not the problem. The problem is the 0.3 seconds before the 8 that the suit's processing architecture apparently experienced as a gap in its own operational record. Tony is quiet for a moment. Then he says that the gap was not a malfunction. The gap was accurate. His suit simply had nothing to record because nothing, within the framework his sensors used to construct reality, was occurring during that interval. The debrief produces the finding that reframes everything. Hit entered a prepared ambush set by 3 of the most capable strategic minds in the Marvel Universe, identified it as an ambush within seconds of entry, engaged Steve long enough to conduct a calibration assessment of Avengers-level response capability, and withdrew without completing the nominal objective of the evening. The intelligence broker in the safe house is alive and untouched. The operation was not compromised in the conventional sense. It was harvested. The trap became a research tool. And sitting with that assessment in the empty debrief room after the rest of the team has filed out, Steve adds one more implication to the structural analysis he presented that morning. If the criminal network phase was preparation, and the Brooklyn operation confirms that Direct Avengers engagement is currently being treated as calibration data rather than confrontation, then whatever this campaign is building toward has not started yet. 59 eliminations, 6 weeks of systematic structural dismantling, a complete intelligence survey of Marvel's highest-tier response architecture. All of it preliminary, all of it the work that happens before the work begins. Steve sits with that for a long time in the quiet of the empty room. Somewhere outside, in the silence between moments, the preliminary work is finishing, and Marvel is about to find out what it was preliminary to. The leak does not happen through a single catastrophic breach of operational security. It happens the way all genuinely dangerous information eventually escapes containment, through the accumulation of too many people holding pieces of something too strange to fully suppress and too unsettling to entirely keep to themselves. A S.H.I.E.L.D. forensic technician mentions the timestamp anomalies to a contractor over lunch in language clinical enough to say, and procedural and specific enough that anyone with the right professional background understands immediately that something unprecedented is being described. A Hydra analyst whose network has lost 4 structural nodes in 3 weeks files an internal assessment that uses the phrase systematic architectural targeting in a document that, despite its classification level, moves through 3 different organizational hands before the weekends. A mercenary who left a safe house in Madripoor 30 seconds before it became operationally relevant tells the story in the careful, heavily edited way that people tell stories they are not entirely certain they believe. In a bar to 2 colleagues whose professional experience is extensive enough to understand what the edited parts are hiding. Within 10 days, the information ecosystem of Marvel's Underworld is carrying the story in fragments. No name, no face, no confirmed origin. Just the outline of something operating in the spaces between the normal categories of threat, killing with a precision that the existing vocabulary of professional violence cannot adequately describe. What assembles itself from those fragments is not intelligence in any operational sense, it is mythology. And mythology moves faster than intelligence, travels through channels that classified information cannot access, and achieves a psychological impact that no threat briefing document ever produced by any agency has ever matched. The language circulating through Madripoor safe houses and New York back rooms and the encrypted channels of mercenary networks carries the specific weight of genuine, foundational fear rather than the performed toughness that professional criminal culture deploys as its default social register. The distinction matters. These are people who have spent careers managing proximity to lethal force. They are not afraid of being hurt. They are not afraid of being beaten or captured or outgunned. What the fragments describe is something that produces a different category of fear entirely, the fear of being concluded rather than confronted, of being removed from the operational picture not through overwhelming force but through a precision so complete that the removal happens inside a fraction of a second and the surrounding environment does not register that anything has changed until the absence has already been finalized. Criminal culture can process a known threat. It has protocols for that. What it cannot process is a threat that arrives without identity, without motive declaration, without the performed dominance that normally lets you know who to pay or run from or negotiate with. There is no face. There is only the aftermath. T'Challa receives the full compiled Wakandan intelligence package on the same morning the Avengers are conducting their 3rd strategic review and reads it in his preferred manner, completely and without interruption, in the quiet of his private study before forming any response. The behavioral profile assembled by his operatives across 3 criminal networks is the most comprehensive picture currently existing of whatever is operating in Marvel's shadows, and T'Challa reads it with the specific attention he reserves for documents that his instincts classify as categorically significant rather than merely urgent. What strikes him most forcefully is not the power implications or the tactical analysis, both of which are remarkable on their own terms. It is the psychological signature, the absolute, comprehensive, zero-exception elimination of ego from every documented operational decision. Target selection optimized purely for structural consequence with no symbolic or performative dimension whatsoever. Methodology varied only to maintain operational effectiveness, never to demonstrate capability. Withdrawal executed the moment the operational objective is achieved or definitively denied, with no engagement sustained beyond its functional purpose. T'Challa has spent his entire life surrounded by extraordinary power and understands at a foundational level that power almost universally wants to be known. It performs itself. It builds mythology around itself deliberately. What the behavioral profile describes performs nothing. It simply produces outcomes and moves to the next calculation. He brings the Wakandan kinetic sensor data to the table that the Avengers' response efforts have not yet accessed. The sensors, distributed through diplomatic and intelligence channels across major cities and running passive collection for years as a general-purpose strategic intelligence asset, have been recording environmental data that Tony's purpose-built temporal network was specifically engineered to catch but caught only after extensive calibration. What T'Challa's general-purpose sensors caught accidentally across 47 confirmed incident locations is a kinetic displacement signature that carries a characteristic no Wakandan analyst has previously encountered in field data. The consistency coefficient is not high. It is absolute. Force delivery across every documented incident is identical to a precision that implies the motion producing it has been executed so many thousands of times over such an extended period that biological variation has been functionally eliminated from the output. T'Challa presents this finding to the assembled strategic intelligence of the Avengers without editorial framing because the finding does not require any. Then he adds the single implication the room has been avoiding articulating directly. They are not analyzing an entity that has learned to be precise. They are analyzing precision that has had 600 years to become indistinguishable from physical law. The room receives this in the specific silence of people who came into the meeting hoping for a problem and have instead been given a condition. Dr. Strange constructs the causal archaeology spell on a Sunday evening with Wong present as witness, and the Sanctum's deeper ambient systems running passive support for the working. The spell is not a detection sweep or a combat application. It is forensic reconstruction at the temporal level, an attempt to read the scar tissue that repeated micro-interventions in local causal fabric leave in the timeline's structural memory, and trace those scars back through their shared geometric origin to a source coordinate. The construction takes 4 hours of concentrated working. The execution takes 11 seconds. The result is not what Strange expected. He anticipated coordinates, a location, a being he could begin to categorize within his extensive taxonomy of temporally anomalous entities. What the spell returns instead is the mystical equivalent of a mirror producing no reflection, not blocked, not shielded, not defended against in any of the ways that powerful entities defend themselves against mystical detection when they are aware of being searched for. Simply absent from the register that his awareness uses to locate and classify things, as if whatever produced the causal scarring does not exist in the ontological category that magical perception is built to find. He sits with the null result for a long moment and then approaches the problem from a different foundational direction, working not from detection, but from memory. Not his memory, the timelines. Every location that has been interfered with retains, in the structural fabric of local causality, a faint impression of the interference the way a surface retains warmth after the heat source has moved on. Strange reads those impressions not for coordinates or identity, signatures, but for quality, texture, the phenomenological character of whatever produced them. What he finds is something he does not have precise existing language for and spends a considerable time attempting to describe accurately to Wong afterward. The closest approximation his vocabulary of the impossible can produce is this: the presence that left those impressions in the timeline is not performing anything. It is not hunting or competing or demonstrating or pursuing any objective that carries emotional weight beyond the immediate functional one. It is completing purpose with the same quality of intentionality that a river has when it finds the lowest available path through a landscape. Not a decision made against alternatives, a nature expressing itself in the only direction it knows. Strange has encountered pure evil in forms that would break most human minds. He has stood in the presence of beings whose appetite for destruction is so vast it constitutes a kind of terrible grandeur. He has never encountered anything that felt this completely, this aggressively, this almost peacefully emptied of everything except the flawless execution of its own nature. Wong asks him if that makes it less dangerous. Strange says it makes it the most dangerous thing he has encountered in a decade of encountering things that redefined his understanding of dangerous. He makes 2 calls. The first to Tony Stark, 11 minutes of theoretical ground that leaves Tony rebuilding his detection architecture from a different foundational assumption. The second call Strange makes is internal, into the deeper registers of his own strategic awareness, running the full implication chain of what the causal archaeology produced against every relevant precedent in his extensive experience. The chain produces one output that he does not share with Tony or Wong or anyone on the Avengers strategy.
I see, team, because the output is not tactical intelligence. It is a recognition.
The being moving through Marvel's shadows is not a visitor operating outside its natural context. Whatever environment produced it, whatever 6th century history of professional operation shaped it into what it currently is, the methodology it is deploying in Marvel's universe is not strained or adapted or running below its optimal parameters in an unfamiliar environment. It is completely at home, which means the Marvel universe, with all its extraordinary complexity and layered power and institutional sophistication, is not a challenging environment for this operator. It is a familiar category of problem, and that recognition, sitting in the deep quiet of the sanctum long after both calls have ended, is what moves the situation in Strange's private assessment from significant to something he does not have a comfortable word for and does not attempt to find one. What none of them know yet is that HIT has been aware of each investigative development with a comprehensiveness that would, if they understood it, retroactively reframe every strategic meeting they have held since Week 2 as a performance conducted for an audience they did not know was present. The Wakandan behavioral profile, the most accurate picture assembled of his operational nature, he is allowed to approach accuracy because a correct assessment produces predictable institutional responses, and predictable responses are operationally preferable to the unpredictable ones that emerge from confusion. Strange's causal archaeology he simply did not exist within when it ran, occupying a temporal address that the spell's foundational framework could not reach, for the same reason that a net designed to catch fish cannot catch water. Tony's recalibrated sensor network he continues to manage through interval variation, feeding the modeling architecture data points calibrated to keep its predictive accuracy hovering just below operationally actionable without triggering the recognition that it is being managed. And Steve's structural analysis, the one finding in the entire assembled response effort that correctly identified the criminal network phase as preparation rather than campaign, he has addressed by accelerating the timeline for whatever the preparation was preparing for. Because the margin between Marvel's current understanding of the situation and an accurate understanding of it is narrowing. And narrowing margins, in the long operational mathematics of 6 centuries of professional work, have always meant that the window for acting before the margin closes is also narrowing. Somewhere in the silence between moments, a decision that has been building since the first day in the alley has just finished being made. The preparation is complete. What it was preparing for is about to begin. The operation is Steve's design from the ground up, and it is, by any objective measure applied to the available intelligence and operational constraints, an excellent one. The foundational logic is clean. HIT has demonstrated a consistent behavioral pattern of targeting structural nodes in criminal and intelligence networks. One visible surviving node, positioned correctly, should function as an irresistible operational prompt for an entity whose methodology is built around systematic dismantling of exactly that category of target. The Shield Safehouse in Brooklyn contains a mid-level Hydra intelligence broker named Reeves, whose name appears in 3 of the reconstructed network maps as a surviving load-bearing communication point. Leave him visible. Surround him invisibly. Engage from a position of prepared advantage rather than reactive response. Tony overhead in a high-altitude suit running passive temporal discontinuity monitoring through the upgraded network architecture. T'Challa Atsa crossed the street in civilian clothing with Wakandan kinetic sensors woven into the fabric of his jacket running continuous environmental baseline collection. Steve inside the building. The geometry is sound, the coverage is layered, the response coordination is rehearsed. The foundational assumption is wrong. Hit enters through the service entrance at 3:17 a.m., and Steve knows the precise moment of entry, not because any sensor trips, and not because Tony's overhead feed registers an anomaly, and not because T'Challa's exterior observation flags a kinetic event. He knows because the quality of the silence inside the building changes. It is a subtle change, not measurable by any instrument currently deployed in the operational space, and it would be entirely imperceptible to any human sensory system not trained by decades of warfare to treat silence as an active information source rather than the absence of one. Matt Murdock would call it the silence of occupied space. Steve calls it nothing because he is already moving, shield coming up in the same fluid motion as rising from the chair, body rotating to face the corridor entrance before the conscious categorization of the signal has completed its processing cycle. The first exchange happens in a window of real time that Steve's post-engagement reconstruction estimates at approximately 90 seconds. His adrenalized perception experiences it as considerably longer, which is itself informative because Steve's perception under combat stress is among the most accurate and least distorting operating in any human-derived nervous system currently active. The first strike comes from a vector his threat modeling did not generate as primary, not the corridor entrance, not the window, not any of the 4 approach angles his tactical preparation assigned the highest probability weighting. The shield intercepts it because Steve has spent enough time and enough fights to learn that the highest probability approach is always worth covering, and the 0 probability approach is always worth having one layer of defense on, because opponents worth taking seriously have a tendency to identify and exploit the gap between those two assessments. The vibration transmitted through the vibranium face is not massive. Nothing about this engagement is massive in the conventional sense that Steve's combat experience has taught him to read as the primary indicator of danger. The strike is precise in a way that the shield's composition communicates with a clarity that no larger force would have produced. The pressure delivered to the exact quadrant of the face that, connecting with the target rather than the shield, would have ended the equation in its first second. Steve has felt Thor's full force transmitted through this shield. He has felt the Hulk's. Neither of them communicated information the way this strike does. Thor and the Hulk hit the shield like weather events. This hit the shield like a question about his defensive architecture delivered in the language of applied force. He answers with everything he has, and everything Steve Rogers has is genuinely extraordinary. The accumulated tactical intelligence of a man who has been fighting wars for the better part of a century, processed through the physical capability of the most optimized human biology ever produced by any enhancement program, expressed through a combat fluency that has made opponents operating at power levels far above his own experience moments of genuine threat. Against Hit, it produces the most informed and precisely executed fight of Steve's career, and it is functionally insufficient. Not because Hit is overwhelmingly more powerful in any raw physical sense that Steve can measure and account for, because Hit does not give him the thing his tactical intelligence requires to function at its highest capacity. Pattern. Every fighter produces pattern, the rhythm of their movement, the sequence of their attack preferences, the microtells in body language that precede commitment to a strike direction, the way their defensive posture shifts when they are covering a weakness versus creating an angle. 6 decades of warfare have made Steve's ability to read that pattern the most dangerous thing he brings to any engagement. Hit produces none. Between engagements, the stillness is so complete that Steve's threat-reading instincts find no surface to process. Inside engagements, every movement is the minimum geometry for the maximum necessary outcome, and nothing beyond that. He is fighting a conclusion that keeps deciding when to be a fight and when to be architecture. Tony arrives through the roof at 3:17 and 51 seconds, which is 8 seconds from the moment his passive monitoring registered a kinetic anomaly in the building's internal environment to physical presence in the operational space. 8 seconds is, by any reasonable professional benchmark, an exceptional emergency response time from a standing start at 3,000 feet. Tony knows before he finishes the thought that it does not matter. He enters the corridor at the moment the time skip deploys, and his suit's processing architecture does something it has never done in combat, in testing, in any operational context across the entirety of its deployment history. It skips. A single processing cycle, 0.3 seconds in duration, simply produces no output. Not a system failure, not a sensor error, not a processing bottleneck from simultaneous input overload. The suit is running at full operational capacity on either side of the gap. Inside the gap, there is nothing. Clean, precise, total absence of data where the most sophisticated personal combat system on the planet was simply not processing because what was occurring during this at interval was occurring in a register that the system's foundational architecture does not have the capacity to access. Tony lands in the corridor and finds Steve upright, shield raised, breathing with the specific controlled rhythm of someone managing a physiological stress response through practiced discipline. The corridor is empty. Tony runs his reconstruction algorithm against the physical evidence in the space and looks at the confidence interval the system produces for what just occurred. Then he says quietly, without any of his usual performance of composure, that they need a completely different framework for thinking about this. T'Challa's exterior observation data, integrated with Tony's overhead feed and Steve's tactical recall in the post-engagement reconstruction, produces a finding that reframes the entire operational picture more completely than any previous intelligence development. HIT did not attempt to complete the contract. The intelligence broker in the safe house is alive, untouched, unaware that anything operationally significant occurred in the building he was sitting in. HIT entered a prepared ambush, identified its architecture within seconds of entry, engaged the highest value tactical intelligence in the building for the duration of time required to conduct a thorough calibration assessment of Avengers-level response capability, and withdrew with the collected data, having invested the minimum engagement time necessary to gather it. The trap was not compromised. It was not defeated or overcome or outmaneuvered in any conventional sense. It was used. The carefully constructed ambush geometry, the layered coverage, the rehearsed response coordination, the tactical preparation that represented the combined strategic output of three of Marvel's most capable operational minds was experienced by its target as a scheduled research appointment. And it delivered. HIT now has comprehensive calibration data on Tony's response time and suit capability ceiling, on Steve's combat intelligence and physical performance parameters, on T'Challa's sensor architecture and exterior observation methodology, on the coordination rhythm and communication latency of the assembled response team. The trap gave him everything. It gave the team a confirmation that the engagement was not random, that they are dealing with something that treats direct confrontation with Marvel's best as data collection rather than conflict. Steve calls the debrief room to silence after everyone has spoken, and the assembled findings are sitting in the air with the particular weight of implications that have been stated, but not yet fully absorbed. Then he adds the piece that his structural analysis produced hours before the operation, and that the operation has now confirmed beyond the threshold of reasonable doubt. The criminal network phase was not the campaign. The Brooklyn engagement was not the campaign. Both were preliminary. Both were gathering specific categories of operational intelligence that a being of HIT's strategic sophistication would require before beginning the actual campaign, whatever its objective is. 59 eliminations producing comprehensive degradation of Marvel's Underworld communication and coordination infrastructure. 1 direct Avengers engagement producing complete calibration data on Marvel's highest-tier tactical response capability. Both phases now complete. Both datasets now in possession of an entity that processes and applies operational intelligence at a speed and depth that 6 centuries of professional refinement have elevated beyond anything the assembled team's experience has prepared them to model accurately. Steve pauses here in the way that he pauses when what he is about to say is the part he genuinely wishes he did not have to say. Whatever HIT came to this universe to do, he now has everything he needed to prepare for doing it, and Marvel has spent 8 weeks watching the preparation without identifying what the preparation was for. The debrief room empties in the specific way that rooms empty when the briefing has produced more questions than it resolved, and the questions are the serious kind that do not resolve quickly or comfortably. Tony stays. He sits in the empty room with his suit's 0.3-second gap displayed on a holographic render above the table, looking at the clean edges of the absence with the focused attention he reserves for engineering problems that are also philosophical problems, which are the problems he finds genuinely interesting when they are not also genuinely terrifying. The gap is not a sensor failure. The gap is accurate. His system recorded nothing during that interval, because during that interval, within the physical framework his suit uses to construct its model of operational reality, nothing was occurring. Whatever was occurring somewhere else. In the interval, in the space between the moments his architecture uses as its foundational building blocks. He has built systems that account for superspeed, for teleportation, for dimensional displacement, for temporal manipulation at the large scale. He has never had to account for something that lives in the gap between the moments his temporal sensors use to measure time. He starts a new engineering document. At the top, he writes a single line that he has never written at the top of an engineering document before. The question is not how to see inside the interval. The question is how to make the interval itself dangerous to occupy. He stares at that line for a long time. Somewhere outside in the pre-dawn quiet of Brooklyn, in the silence between heartbeats, something that has just completed its preparation phase is beginning to decide what comes next. And the most brilliant engineer in the Marvel Universe is sitting in an empty room trying to build a weapon for a battlefield that exists between seconds. Strange chooses the location with the same deliberate precision he brings to every strategic decision that carries consequences he cannot fully model in advance. Not the sanctum sanctorum, which is layered with defensive enchantments that would contaminate the observational clarity he needs from this encounter and telegraph an aggressive intent that would undermine its entire purpose. Not a populated area, for reasons requiring no elaboration. A decommissioned industrial complex in New Jersey that Wakandan movement pattern analysis has flagged as sitting at the intersection of three of HIT's probable operational corridors, a location carrying no civilian presence, no institutional significance, and no ambient magical interference that would distort what Strange needs to read from direct proximity. He is not building a trap. He built a trap once in this situation and watched it become a research tool for its intended target. What he is building tonight is something he has used exactly twice before in his career, in encounters with entities whose nature exceeded his existing framework so completely that combat would have been epistemically premature. He is building a context for direct observation. He arrives 6 hours early and spends 4 of them making the space ready in ways that have nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with perception. HIT arrives at 11:40 p.m. Strange registers the precise moment of entry not through any sensor or detection architecture, but through the change in the temporal texture of the space. That quality he has spent weeks refining his sensitivity to, the faint structural redaction that recent time carries in locations where the interval has been accessed. He does not move. He does not raise a defensive construct or reach for an offensive application. He stands in the center of the space with his hands open at his sides, which is the closest thing his physical vocabulary has to a declaration of non-combative intent, and says at conversational volume directed toward the far end of the building that he is not a target and not a threat, and that he would like to understand what he is dealing with before this situation reaches a point where both parties' available options narrow in ways that serve neither of them. The silence that follows lasts 8 seconds. Then HIT steps into the ambient light, coat buttoned, hands loose, expression carrying the specific quality of total neutrality that Strange has been reading in the temporal aftermath of his operations for weeks and is now encountering in person for the first time. Up close, that neutrality is more profound than the residue suggested. It is not the performed composure of powerful beings who have decided to present themselves as unreadable. It is the genuine article. There is simply nothing performing. What Strange registers in the first seconds of direct proximity confirms the causal archaeology findings and extends them in directions those findings could only gesture toward. There is no magical aura, no dimensional residue, no energetic signature belonging to any school or tradition in any universe Strange has cataloged across a career that spans more dimensions than most beings know exist. What there is, readable to his awareness the way temperature is readable to exposed skin, is something his taxonomy of the supernatural has no existing entry for. The closest approximation his vocabulary can produce is a word he normally reserves for fundamental physical forces rather than individual entities. Inevitability. Not the performed certainty of powerful beings who have decided they are unstoppable. Something older and quieter than that. the inevitability of a law expressing itself through a form that has been doing what it does for long enough that the doing has stopped being an action and become a state of being. Strange has stood in the presence of the Infinity Stones. He has negotiated with entities whose age makes civilizations look like Tuesday afternoons. He has encountered the embodiments of abstract universal concepts given temporary form. None of them felt like this. None of them felt this thoroughly, this peacefully, this completely like themselves. He deploys the opening probe he spent 3 of his 6 preparatory hours designing. Not an attack, a precisely shaped mystical inquiry, calibrated to produce a readable response signature that he can analyze for dimensional origin, power classification, and temporal relationship to the local universe without triggering a defensive response from its subject. The probe goes out with the shaped precision of his best working, finds hit at its center, and returns with nothing. Not a deflection, not a counter-response, not the null signature of active mystical shielding. Nothing, in the specific phenomenological sense that the probe encountered no surface within the register it uses to map its environment. Strange has encountered this quality of non-response in exactly one previous context across his entire career. Fundamental constants of reality. Gravity does not return a mystical probe. Entropy does not return a mystical probe, not because they are hidden or defended, but because they are not the kind of thing that the probe's foundational framework was constructed to locate. He fires the probe twice more from different angular approaches, adjusting the sensitivity parameters between each attempt. The results are identical. Whatever hit is at his foundational level, he is not in the register that magical awareness uses to build its map of what exists. Hit speaks during the 4th minute of the encounter, not in response to the probes, which he appears to register with the same comprehensive, undramatic attention he brings to every input, but in response to something in Strange's methodology that produces, for the first time in the encounter, what might be interpreted as a minimal professional courtesy. He says that Strange is attempting to read something that is not a signature. His voice carries the same quality as his physical presence. No performance, no register of dominance or threat or any of the social functions that speech normally serves when powerful entities address each other in potentially adversarial contexts. Pure information delivery. Strange is quiet for a moment that stretches longer than his usual processing intervals, which is itself a tell for anyone watching closely enough. Then he asks what it is instead. It considers the question with the quality of consideration that looks from outside like absolute stillness and carries to Strange's awareness the sensation of a very large, very precise calculation completing itself in real time. Then he says that it is a question of interval, that everything Strange's framework is built to work with, magic, probability, causality, the entire architecture of mystical awareness and reality manipulation, operates between moments, and that he operates inside them. Strange receives this not as a boast or a threat, but as a technical specification delivered with the dispassion of someone describing the weather. He sits with it for a long time, because it is the most clarifying and most disturbing description of a power set he has ever received directly from the being that possesses it.
What follows is not a fight. It is the most extraordinary collision of operational frameworks that Strange has conducted outside of formal negotiations with cosmic-level entities, and it produces more genuinely new understanding of the problem in 90 minutes than the previous 8 weeks of institutional response effort generated collectively. Strange begins testing the boundaries of what probability architecture can accomplish at the causal level, deploying constructs specifically designed to operate not on hit directly, but on the space around him, the local probability field, the available decision geometry of the interval itself. Hit moves through the first 3 constructs without apparent friction, his movement through their restrictions carrying the same quality of ease that water carries moving through any channel that is not narrower than the water itself. He pauses inside the 4th, the one Strange built around probability compression at the causal level rather than spatial restriction, the one designed to narrow the range of available outcomes inside the interval rather than the interval's geographic boundaries. The pause is brief, not struggle, not danger, but resistance, faint and genuine, and enormously informative. The first real resistance anything in Marvel's universe has produced against Hit's methodology. Strange notes it with the focused intensity of a scientist who has just found the boundary of a phenomenon he had begun to suspect was boundless. Hit withdraws at a moment entirely of his own choosing, smoothly, without the interval signature being detectable until he is already gone, which tells Strange two things simultaneously. That Hit suppressed the temporal residue deliberately during the withdrawal, which means he has significantly more conscious control over the expression of his ability than the incident data suggested, and that he chose
to allow the residue to be detectable during the engagement itself, which means the entire encounter was conducted on terms Hit found acceptable, including the discovery of the probability compression resistance point. Strange stands alone in the industrial space for a long time afterward, running the full implication chain of what 90 minutes of direct observation produced. The conclusion is uncomfortable in its honesty and clarifying in its precision. He can contest Hit. He found the edge. The specific category of mystical architecture that produces genuine friction against interval-based movement is identifiable, buildable, and deployable. The gap between finding the edge and reliably deploying the architecture at the speed a direct engagement requires is enormous and represents the most demanding technical challenge currently on his operational plate. But the edge exists. And in a situation where the prevailing assessment has been that Marvel's mystical layer might have no purchase against this methodology at all, the existence of an edge is everything. 3,000 miles away and several hours later, in a monitoring station that exists partially outside conventional spatial coordinates and entirely outside the awareness of any terrestrial institution, something stirs that has not stirred in response to events on the terrestrial sphere in a period measured in decades. The watcher assigned to this solar system has maintained his vigil across every significant event in Marvel's history with the absolute unchanging attentiveness that his function demands and his oath enforces. He has observed the rise of the Avengers. He has watched Thanos acquire and deploy the full complement of Infinity Stones. He has witnessed the deaths and resurrections of gods and the births of new cosmic forces and the narrowest possible survivals of a civilization that seems constitute, finally committed to placing itself at the edge of extinction before remembering how to step back. He has cataloged every category of extraordinary event the universe produces with the comprehensive, neutral attention of an observer who has promised never to be anything more than an observer. He reviews the accumulated data from Hit's 8 weeks in the Marvel Universe 3 times. Not because the power level is unprecedented, because the classification is. The being currently operating in the terrestrial sphere does not fit any category in the observational framework the Watchers use to organize their eternal record. Not enhanced individual, not temporal entity, not cosmic construct, not dimensional refugee, not any subdivision of any category in a taxonomy built across billions of years of comprehensive universal observation. Something that has no entry in the Watcher's record has just spent 8 weeks operating inside their most closely monitored civilization, and in the vast, ancient, impassive awareness of that eternal observer, something that is not quite alarm, but occupies alarm's precise address registers for the first time in longer than most civilizations have existed. The universe has just acknowledged that it contains something it does not have the language to describe. And in Marvel, the things the universe cannot describe are always, without exception, the things that matter most. The convergence does not happen because Marvel sets another trap. It happens because Hit chooses it. That is the first thing Steve understands when the situation report arrives at 2:47 a.m., and he reads the operational geometry of what is unfolding across 4 city blocks in Lower Manhattan with the specific quality of recognition that only activates when a pattern you have been trying to identify suddenly becomes visible in its entirety, simultaneously. The location is not random, the timing is not coincidental. The configuration of circumstances that has aligned to bring EVIA's eerie major adaptive countermeasure into a single operational theater on a single night reflects a level of situational engineering that requires both comprehensive intelligence about those countermeasures and the strategic sophistication to arrange conditions that make their convergence feel organic rather than constructed. Hit is not walking into a fight. He is not walking into an ambush. He is walking into a conclusion he has decided to reach on a timeline and in a configuration of his own design. The most unsettling thing about this realization, which Steve has approximately 90 seconds to sit with before the operational demands of the situation consume his full attention, is that being aware of it changes almost nothing about how they have to respond. Strange deploys the probability architecture first because the construction window it requires at the causal level is the longest lead time element in the assembled response, and because everything else in the convergence depends on the friction it introduces, being operational before HIT is fully engaged. He builds it across a 3-block radius centered on the last confirmed kinetic signature from T'Challa's sensor network, compressing local probability not into a single forced outcome but into a narrowed corridor of available outcomes, reducing the operational decision space inside the engagement zone, the way canyon walls reduce the available directions for the river running between them. The construction cost is significant. The most technically demanding working Strange has executed outside of world-ending scenarios. It draws on his reserves at a rate that narrows his capacity for simultaneous action to a degree that would concern him in any other operational context. He accepts this cost because the alternative has been defined with complete precision by 8 weeks of evidence. Leave HIT's interval fully open, and the engagement ends before it produces the data the convergence is designed to generate. The canyon will not stop him. It will introduce friction into a methodology that has operated without friction for 6 centuries. And friction, at the level this situation is operating at, is not a minor inconvenience. Friction is the difference between a surgical strike and a contested engagement. Friction is the only thing that makes the next 30 minutes a conversation rather than a conclusion. Tony enters from the northeast at 3,000 feet and drops to engagement altitude in 4 seconds. The repulsor array cycling to combat power, the predictive combat layer running at full operational capacity, feeding probability distributions for HIT's positional emergence from each time skip into the targeting architecture at 60 calculation cycles per second. The 67% accuracy rate from controlled simulation holds for approximately the first 40 seconds of engagement. 40 seconds is long enough for Tony to confirm that the system works against a live target in a dynamic environment. It is also long enough for HIT to work out the system's predictive logic from the pattern of Tony's targeting responses and begin introducing the minimum variation necessary to degrade its accuracy without disrupting the efficiency of his own operational tempo. The adjustments are small. Micro variations in skip duration measured in hundredths of a second. Exit position displacements of inches from the optimal angles the predictive model calculates. Entry vector change is so subtle that Tony's targeting architecture requires several cycles to detect them as intentional rather than environmental. Each adjustment by itself is operationally negligible. Accumulated across 40 seconds of continuous engagement, they reduce the predictive accuracy from 67% to 51%. Ton. He is fighting a being that is reprogramming his most sophisticated countermeasure in real time using nothing more than the minimum necessary behavioral variation and doing it without any apparent reduction in its own offensive output. Steve coordinates the ground response from the western perimeter, directing T'Challa and 2 additional Avengers through a geometric coverage pattern designed to eliminate clean withdrawal vectors from the operational area without concentrating enough force in any single position to create a target worth engaging directly. The theory is layered coverage at sufficient density that any withdrawal path HIT selects passes through at least 2 response elements before reaching open space. In practice, the geometry holds for 90 seconds, which Steve counts as a genuine tactical achievement against an opponent whose spatial reading is as comprehensive as HIT's demonstrated capability suggests. Then the geometry begins to degrade. Not through overwhelming force or dramatic breach, through movement so economical and spatially precise that it finds the micro-gaps between coverage positions the way a key finds the specific configuration of tumblers in a lock it was cut for. HIT does not break the pattern. He reads the pattern in real time and moves within it, threading the geometric restrictions with a spatial intelligence that has had 6 centuries to refine itself against every category of coordinated tactical response that multiple civilizations have been able to produce. Steve adjusts. HIT adjusts. Steve adjusts again. The exchange is extraordinary in its tactical precision and genuinely, deeply instructive about the ceiling of human strategic intelligence when deployed against something that has been operating above that ceiling for longer than most human institutions have existed.
The pivot happens at the 4-minute and 17-second mark, and it happens because of Peter Parker, who was not in the operational brief, who was not coordinated into the response framework, who was not informed of the convergence operation because the briefing happened during his Thursday afternoon organic chemistry lecture, and nobody thought to pull him out of class for a situation that was still in its final preparation phase when the lecture started. He picks up the conflict signatures from 6 blocks away, the specific combination of energy discharge and kinetic event, and the low sustained pressure his danger sense has been associating with this particular operational presence since the Midtown corridor. And he arrives at the engagement zone perimeter with zero tactical context, zero coordination with the existing geometric coverage, and zero awareness that the precise operational architecture currently deployed across 4 city blocks has been carefully constructed to function as a unified system rather than a collection of individual responses. He arrives with his instincts and his danger sense, and his complete constitutional inability to remain uninvolved in a fight happening in his city. And he introduces into an engagement that HIT's 6-century-old methodology has been reading and managing with comprehensive spatial control since its first second, something that 6 centuries of operating against ordered systems has not fully prepared him for. Genuine, unscripted, emotionally driven chaos arriving from an unmodeled vector at the worst possible moment for an operator whose greatest strength is the clean reading of ordered systems. What happens in the 90 seconds following Peter's arrival is the most contested exchange HIT has experienced since entering Marvel's universe, and it happens not through any single element of the assembled response achieving a breakthrough, but through the specific, unrepeatable combination of structured intelligence and pure disorder operating simultaneously at different scales. Strange's probability canyon, already compressing HIT's operational decision space, interacts with Peter's movement patterns in ways that compound the restriction geometrically rather than additively. The chaotic unpredictability of Spider-Man's trajectory creating interference patterns in the probability field that Strange's architecture was not designed to produce and cannot fully control now that they are occurring. Tony's predictive system, which HIT has been managing down to 51% accuracy through careful micro-variation, fires 3 consecutive accurate predictions in a row for the first time in the engagement, the targeting finding genuine purchase against a movement profile that Peter's arrival has disrupted just enough to interrupt the precise variation sequence HIT was using to keep the algorithm below actionable threshold. Steve's geometric coverage, degraded by 6 minutes of HIT threading its gaps, partially reconstitutes itself because Peter is filling holes he cannot see by following the directional pressure of his danger sense toward exactly the coordinates where danger is currently most concentrated, which happen to be exactly the coordinates the geometric coverage was designed to make dangerous. The repulsor fires at 4 minutes 51 seconds and connects, not cleanly, not with the centered full-power impact that Tony's targeting architecture was built to deliver. A glancing contact, displaced from optimal by HIT's final micro-adjustment, catching the left side of HIT's coat at an angle that its temporal displacement has reduced to approximately 30% of its full energy transfer. The shockwave from the partial impact radiates outward in a compressed sphere, cracking the asphalt beneath them in a 6-foot radius and blowing out the windows of 2 parked vehicles on the adjacent street. By any objective physical accounting, it is an inconsequential strike against a being of HIT's demonstrated capability. The force absorbed is negligible relative to his operational parameters. The physical effect on his combat capacity is functionally 0, but it lands. In 8 weeks of operation across Marvel's universe, across 59 professional engagements, the Brooklyn calibration encounter, the New Jersey conversation, and 4 minutes and 50 seconds of this convergence, nothing has landed. The physics of the moment settle into the awareness of everyone present with a weight that is entirely, completely disproportionate to the objective physical significance of the impact. Strange feels it through the probability architecture as a confirmation that friction introduced at the causal level produces real operational consequence. Steve sees it from the western perimeter and files it not as a victory, but as the first empirical proof of concept for a principle the entire convergence was designed to test.
The ceiling can be touched, not broken, not overcome. Touched. Hit withdraws through a vector that is not covered because nothing is ever perfectly covered, and he is better at finding what is not covered than anything Marvel has yet encountered. The withdrawal is smooth, unhurried, carrying none of the qualities that physical contact in a contested engagement typically produces in a combatant's movement signature. No disruption, no urgency, no external indication that the last 90 seconds produced anything other than another comprehensive data set to add to the operational picture. Tony's sensors track the withdrawal for 4 seconds before the temporal signature drops below detectable threshold and the trace goes cold. The assembled response stands in the operational space in the specific silence of people who have just done something extraordinary and knew simultaneously that extraordinary was not quite enough. Strange releases the probability architecture and feels the expenditure it required settle into his reserves as a fatigue that will take 24 hours to fully clear. Steve is already running the post-engagement analysis in the part of his mind that never stops running post-engagement analysis regardless of what the rest of him is doing. And Tony is standing in the cracked asphalt looking at the precise location where the repulsor made contact, at the scorch pattern that the partial impact left in the ground, and doing the specific kind of mathematics that his mind does when it has just found the number it needed to build the next thing. The ceiling can be touched. The question the next phase of this situation will answer is whether touching it and breaking through it are problems of the same kind or problems of entirely different kinds. Somewhere in the silence between moments, a calculation that has never before produced an unresolved result is running for the second time. And for the first time in 600 years of professional operation, the result is taking longer than expected to arrive. He does not leave. That is the first thing worth understanding about how this story ends, because the temptation when the convergence engagement concludes with Iron Man's repulsor making contact and hit withdrawing through an uncovered vector is to read the sequence as a resolution. Marvel pushed back. The ceiling was touched. The threat retreated. File it under managed and move forward. That reading is available, and it is wrong in the specific way that comfortable readings of uncomfortable situations are usually wrong, by prioritizing the emotional satisfaction of a conclusion over the operational accuracy of a continuing condition. Hit did not retreat. Retreat implies a direction away from an objective that remains relevant. Hit withdrew because the convergence produced everything he needed from it, and continuing past that point would have been operationally wasteful, which is the one category of action his methodology has spent 6 centuries eliminating from its repertoire entirely. He is still in the city, in the silence between moments, running the first calculation in his professional career that has not resolved on its standard timeline, and that unresolved calculation, sitting in whatever serves as the quiet center of 600 years of professional certainty, is the most consequential thing currently happening in the Marvel Universe, not the post-engagement briefings, not the architectural rebuilding Tony has already started on the predictive combat layer. The unresolved calculation. Because when something that has never failed to resolve starts taking longer than expected, the universe that produced the complication has just become a fundamentally different kind of problem. Before the debate begins, and the debate is coming, let the damage speak for itself first. Because the damage, mapped clearly and honestly against the full 8-week operational timeline, is extraordinary in ways that the convergence engagement's partial success can make easy to understate. 59 confirmed eliminations across 4 criminal networks in 8 cities. Not random eliminations, structural ones, each removal chosen for its specific consequence to the load-bearing architecture of the system it belonged to, producing a cascading degradation of organizational coherence that the surviving leadership of those networks is only now beginning to fully comprehend. The Hydra financing channel that Natasha was tracking when she entered the West Village safe house 45 seconds too late has not successfully completed a single communication routing in 3 weeks because every mid-tier node that gave the channel its redundancy is gone. The Magia logistics infrastructure that moved product across 6 northeastern states has contracted to 1/3 of its operational capacity because the coordinators who understood the routing geography well enough to adapt it under pressure are not available to adapt anything anymore. The underworld of 4 cities has been quietly, precisely, comprehensively hollowed out at its structural foundations, while its visible surface remained intact long enough to prevent the kind of emergency consolidation response that might have preserved some of what was lost. The institutional damage runs deeper than the structural. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s threat detection architecture, the layered, redundant, extensively cross-referenced system that represents the accumulated intelligence and operational refinement of decades of defending a world full of supernatural threats, failed to produce a coherent picture of the threat for 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which 59 people were eliminated, and 3 criminal networks were structurally compromised, and the forensic evidence was accumulating in 17 separate case files that no algorithm and no analyst connected into a unified pattern, until Rachel Chen noticed that compression errors do not produce identical duration anomalies across different camera systems in different cities. The system did not fail catastrophically. It failed quietly, in the specific way that systems fail when they encounter a threat category that exists outside the parameters their foundational design assumed would bound the universe of possible threats. That quiet failure is in many ways more damaging to institutional confidence than a dramatic one would have been, because a dramatic failure produces a clear post-mortem and a targeted architectural response. A quiet failure produces the understanding that the architecture's gaps are not visible until something moves through them, which means the gaps you have not yet found are the ones that matter most, and you do not find them until something finds them for you. The psychological damage is harder to quantify and more permanent than either the structural or the institutional. Daredevil sweeps rooms twice now, not as a conscious tactical decision implemented after a strategic review of changed threat parameters. As an instinct, a new layer added to the perceptual protocol his survival has been built on, produced by the specific experience of registering the quality of occupied silence 3 times without finding its source. Black Widow has changed her route patterns 4 times in the past 3 weeks and has not settled into a stable pattern because stable patterns are what she was registering as the absence of when she stood at the threshold of the West Village safe house and the air pressure was fractionally wrong. She knows, with the professional certainty of someone who has spent a career reading environments at the level of their most subtle signals, that stable patterns are what made the 59 targets findable. She does not know how long she will carry this awareness. She suspects the answer is permanently. Peter Parker still feels the low sustained pressure of that first alley encounter when he swings through Midtown at night, the danger sense producing a ghost signal in the specific frequency it used on that Thursday evening, the nervous system's version of a scar tissue memory. These are not small things. These are the permanent revisions to operational behavior that a civilization makes when it has encountered something that its existing frameworks process too slowly to prevent the encounter from leaving a mark. Now the honest accounting. Because this story has always been more interested in accuracy than in satisfying either fanbase's preferred outcome, and accuracy requires mapping Hit's limits with the same precision applied to his capabilities. Thor represents a category of problem that Hit's methodology is specifically ill-equipped to address efficiently, and the script's decision not to force that confrontation is itself the honest analytical choice rather than an evasion of it. An Asgardian god's mythic durability does not simply mean he is hard to damage. It means the timeline between a successful strike and its fatal consequence is long enough to accommodate a recovery and retaliatory response that changes the operational equation entirely. Hit can hurt Thor. Killing him within the clean professional parameters that define Hit's standards and preserve his operational invisibility is a different problem, one that requires a solution specifically engineered for Asgardian biology that his 8 weeks in Marvel have not yet produced. The Hulk presents a related but distinct version of the same challenge. Precision vital point strikes against a target whose biology responds to damage by making the biology more resistant to subsequent damage is a diminishing return proposition that Hit's operational efficiency calculus would identify and decline early in the target assessment process. Neither of these beings stops Hit. They simply occupy a category he routes around rather than through, the way water routes around bedrock rather than attempting to move through it. Doctor Strange is the most important figure in Marvel's response, and the reason is not power. The reason is epistemology. Every other element of the assembled response built its countermeasure architecture around what HIT does. Around the methodology, the time-skip mechanics, the structural targeting logic, the operational patterns, Strange built his around what HIT is, around the nature rather than the expression of the nature. That distinction is the entire margin between a countermeasure that can be adapted around indefinitely and a countermeasure that remains relevant regardless of how the methodology varies because it is engaging the foundational characteristic rather than any of its specific manifestations. The probability compression architecture. Strange deployed in the convergence produced the only genuine friction HIT encountered in 8 weeks of operation in Marvel's universe. Not because it was more powerful than anything else deployed, because it was aimed correctly, at the interval itself, rather than at what moves inside the interval. Strange has the edge now. He found it under operational conditions. The gap between having the edge and deploying it at the speed a direct engagement with HIT requires is the remaining engineering problem, and Strange's post-convergence working sessions have been oriented toward exactly that gap with the focused intensity of a man who understands that the edge he found will not remain exclusive to him indefinitely. HIT found it too. He felt the friction. He knows the shape of the architecture that produced it. And 600 years of professional adaptation means he is already working the problem of what the friction's existence tells him about its limits. So here is the verdict. The complete, honest, no comfortable resolution verdict that this story has been building toward since the first paragraph. HIT enters the Marvel universe and systematically dismantles its underworld infrastructure at the structural level before the universe understands it is being dismantled. He conducts a comprehensive intelligence survey of Marvel's highest-tier response architecture using the universe's own defensive efforts as his primary data source. He dominates every conventional engagement tier, every target that relies on visual reaction speed and direct physical engagement, with a completeness that produces 0 operational failures across 59 professional contracts. He heavily contests the adaptive high-tier response, forcing Tony Stark to rebuild his combat architecture twice, forcing Steve Rogers to revise his foundational assumptions about strategic prediction, forcing T'Challa to activate a threat framework his father's military philosophy classified as theoretical. He encounters genuine friction for the first time in 6 centuries from Strange's probability compression, confirming that Marvel's mystical layer can interact with his methodology at the causal level in a way that no other element of the universe's defense architecture approaches. He discovers that Peter Parker's precognitive nervous system represents the single most disruptive individual variable in Marvel's response ecosystem, not because of power, but because of the specific quality of interference that precognitive chaos introduces into the operational reading of ordered systems. He receives the first glancing blow of his Marvel operation in the convergence engagement and withdraws with the most important data point the 8 weeks have produced. The ceiling is real, it is touchable, and a calculation that has never before taken this long is still running. What HIT proves about Marvel is not that Marvel is weak. Marvel is not weak. What he proves is that Marvel's extraordinary strength is built on a foundational assumption so deep and so universal that the civilization has never had occasion to examine it directly. The assumption that power announces itself, that the scale of a threat is readable in the manner of its arrival, that the gap between the emergence of a danger and its perceivability is functionally 0 because every threat that has or required Marvel's assembled response has made itself perceivable through energy discharge or physical destruction or dramatic declaration before it became decisive. HIT is the proof of concept for everything that assumption leaves undefended. He does not announce himself, he does not perform. He arrives correctly rather than loudly, and in a universe that has built its entire defense architecture around answering the loud, correct is a category of threat that has to be encountered before it can be defended against. Marvel has now encountered it. The defense architecture is being rebuilt in real time around what 8 weeks of evidence has revealed about the gap. The heroes are more careful, more paranoid, more honest about the limits of their own perception than they were before the alley in Midtown, where a man in a coat stood with his hands at his sides and took inventory of a universe that did not know it was being inventoried. That is what HIT leaves behind. Not bodies, though there are bodies. Not broken networks, though there are broken networks. The permanent, irreversible revision of a civilization's understanding of what danger is allowed to look like when it decides to arrive. So tell me, and I mean this genuinely because this is where the real argument starts, who stops him? Not who could beat him in an open fight on a good day with preparation and full power, who actually stops the campaign, who figures out the objective before the objective is reached. Is it Strange, building the probability architecture faster than Hit can adapt around it? Is it Peter, the one variable in the entire universe whose operational profile genuinely does not run on the logic Hit has spent 6 centuries learning to read? Is it Tony, engineering the interval itself into hostile territory from the inside out? Or does Hit reach whatever conclusion brought him to this universe in the first place before any of them close the distance between almost understanding the problem and completely solving it? Drop that answer in the comments, because the silence between moments is still occupied, and the next one has not been decided yet.